Minecraft 1.20 is currently rolling out its snapshots with all of the new blocks and items in them, and I assume you probably want to know how to use them. So today we're going to be going through all the different ways you can use the new decorated pot items in your builds in various different ways. And I gotta say, I think I've come up with some really good ideas this time. So the decorated pot is very different to the other items that have been added in this update that I've covered so far. I've covered the cherry wood and the bamboo wood in other videos, but the decorated pot is more of a standalone item rather than a set of blocks, so it's definitely going to be more focused on decoration rather than something that you're actually going to be building with as a building block. Starting off here, I've just got a few blocks that look good next to it in terms of colour. You got your terracottas, your bricks, polished granite and regular granite. In fact, you make this with bricks, so it matches very well with the brick texture. One thing I hope they add, but it's seeming very unlikely, is the ability to dye these. I would love to be able to dye these different colours, and I've seen some people even mock up what that would look like, and I would love it, similarly to terracotta, if you could make them different colours. As you can see here, I've kind of laid out quite a lot of different ways you can use it, and as you can see, it's definitely more detail focused. The main feature of these pots are the fact that you can combine the various different shards in the game to make unique patterns on the pots. So I've just done a couple of them here. The idea behind these is that they tell some kind of story with the art on the different sides of the pot. So here we've got a map, and then a tree, and then a pickaxe, and then a diamond. Maybe that's telling a story of where to find some treasure. I think especially with things like this, you could use them very well for mini games or little like secret adventures, especially if you're playing in like a multiplayer world. You could leave clues by using these pots. This one could be saying that there's a hidden treasure underneath a tree somewhere. This one has got the skeleton, the creeper, the player, and the warden. It's a design focused on the various different creatures that you can have on them here. And then we got a pickaxe, fishing rod, bow, and sword. And that's just one themed around different tools. There's this many shards, and you know, each pot can have 4, so there's an insane amount of combinations, and you can probably think of many more. I just wanted to give a few examples to start off the video here. Here we have some flower pots. Now this technique is really very cool. And I think the developers definitely modelled the pots in this way in particular to allow this technique to happen. So if you place down a pot and then just put a flower pot on top of it, it gives it that nice extra bit of shape. It also allows you to put a flower in the actual pot. You can't do that for the regular pot, but putting the flower pot on top allows you to do that. And I quite like that little addition. It encourages players to be creative with them rather than just having it be a feature of the pot. So these are just a few examples of what you can do. Anything that can go in a pot can go in these. And if you want to just maybe add a little bit more life, a little bit more pizzazz to some of your builds, it's my favourite word now, dot a few of these pots around. Instead of putting a flower pot, you could have a standing decorated pot like this, and of course you can combine that with the different shards, so you can have that level of customization and then this level of customization to really hone in on that narrative and story that you want to tell with your builds. Mojang has discussed so much. They wanted to make this update about trails and tales, right? They wanted to, one, add more lore to the game and story to the game, and just like hidden little details with all the different archaeological dig sites. They also wanted to give the players the ability to tell their own stories in the world, and this is exactly what they've done. And now, expanding on the idea of these plants, we've got some other little bonsai tree designs here. I really like how they've incorporated the fences into the pots, and it allows you to create these really cute little tree designs. And they're so simple. They're just using a fence to act as the stem of the plant, and then literally a singular leaf block on top. It's a very similar concept to in my previous video where I showed some bonsai trees using the cherry leaves. It's a similar idea to that, but just accomplished a little bit differently. So we've got a birch tree here using the birch fence as the stem. We've got a cherry tree here using the nether brick fence as the stem. We've got an acacia tree that I really like, which uses a andesite wall. It's a little bit thicker, but I think it accomplishes it really nicely because it does match the texture of the acacia log. And then we have a mangrove tree, which I like. These are just some pretty basic examples. I imagine that you can do quite a lot more with this. You know, vary the designs up, little tiny details details are some of my favorite things to build in Minecraft. Like, squeezing the most amount of detail out of the smallest space is one of my favorite things to do. This is just something that you can stick in the corner. It's just a 3-block little detail, but it's something that can add that much more life to your build. Now moving over here, we have some miscellaneous things that I wanted to show. This is a concept for some chains. You can make it look like the pot is hanging by just placing a chain inside the pot, and it's a really good size because a lot of things fit in it. So you can have a chain, have it hanging. Maybe that's a concept for the pot actually like drying. If you want to add that extra story to your world, if you have some kind of area that you're making pots, maybe like a smeltery or something, you could have the pot actually hanging to dry after it's been molded, which I think is very cool. And that also works with the iron bars as well, a similar thing. I think the chain just looks a little bit better though. And of course there are various other items that fit perfectly within the opening in the decorated pot. We have some lightning rods here, fences, and the bamboo fence is a good example of a new fence from the update. And I like this especially because I think it looks like a cork. It's the perfect size, it's 4 pixels wide, so if you have a kind of like brewery type area, some kind of like smeltery, or maybe like a fishing area, that I think makes a very good like sealed bottle here. So imagine something like this. You have your little like brewing area, you've got some various details in there with maybe the barrels, and then just an additional detail that you can have in here. Maybe it's storing some of the brewing materials. Obviously this is like a 2-minute little build here, but imagine this in like an interior. There's just so many more things, there's so many more like extra little stories you can add to your builds with these blocks. For a brewery in particular, there was actually a shard called Brewer, which has a little bottle on the side. That is perfect. And over here they make quite good ends to pillars, especially using the brick wall because it has a very similar colour to that. So I think if you are making some like supports or pillars, this is just like a little like rudimentary archway. These make very good bases. Alternatively, so that's flat, right? If you wanted to add a little bit more depth to this, you could always use them as pillars, and maybe even like, that's not very good. I think that looks quite interesting with the kind of tiled pattern there, and the fact that they're not a full block, I do quite like. Interesting. Expanding on this idea a little bit, we have some other little arches that you can make. And I quite like these designs. You can get some quite nice shaping with these because they're just that much smaller than a block. Both of these are just alternating between a terracotta block and the decorated pot. This one just has 2 decorated pots stacked on top of each other, which gives it a slightly different vibe. And this design is particularly cool because what you can do is you can add extra decoration to these pillars by adding the decorated pots onto the pillars. You can have them tell their own little story. Maybe these are iconic things to whatever village that this arch is for, or maybe you want to tell a story with your base. And of course the design of the pillar itself is also just good. If you just want some pillar designs, you can always do something like that. And it even works with literally just not even breaking it up at all. Just doing a pillar like that also works. There's so many different combinations you can do with these. These are just a couple of examples here. Here we have some lighting options. This is a really good block for adding some lighting into your world and making it interesting. So these could either be used inside a build, outside as standalone little lights, maybe like along a path or something. So you've got a candle which fits in there perfectly, which I really love. I could definitely imagine them along some kind of path. In fact, here's a little mock-up of what they might look like along a path. I quite like that. I do quite like that. We've got the end rod here, which might be a little bit better for like an indoor build perhaps. And adding some kind of light shade on that could be quite interesting for an indoor build. Here's some other end rod designs I made after the main recording. We have the lantern, which fits in there perfectly. There's torch that fits in there perfectly too. The lantern especially would be good for indoor lighting, I think. In fact, for indoor lighting, you can actually do something like that. Kind of strange, but you could have it have the little shards on and add a little bit more intricate decoration to your indoor lighting. And then as well, there's nothing actually in this one. It's actually got a sea lantern underneath. It can be used to quite effectively hide lighting in your builds. If you don't want any lighting on show, but you still want your builds to be lit lit up, then you can actually use these to hide the lighting quite well. Something like the ochre frog light matches quite well with the colours of the decorated pot. And here I've got just a few other different lighting options that you can do. So you've got kind of like an old brick street light here with the lantern on top. Very fine example, I think. And if you wanted just an extra bit of detail, you can add some polished granite underneath, or basically any block that matches, and it just gives it that nice little base and it integrates it quite well into the ground. We've then got some other full block lights here. We've got a lantern in here and a torch in there, just putting the pot on top of a couple of blocks to raise it up a little bit. And then, as we just saw, you can actually hang the lantern on something and it'll still fit in the pot. You could have something like this where it's got an enclosed top and it's got quite a nice shape. It goes in a little bit and then out again. And then here we got a couple of other like standing lights, might be good for a more indoor build. We're just putting a fence on top of the pot and then some kind of lighting block on top. That could be a candle, a torch, or basically anything that goes well on top of a fence. And finally for the lights, we've got a more bulky street light, something a little bit bigger and a little bit more built up. The same general design for the pole of the street light, but then we're going into a more intricate design on top with some granite, with the stairs kind of holding up the two lights. It's a staple of mine, but I do really like these designs. It definitely reminds me of like old English street lights with those really like cobbled streets that like have a lot of these brick tones to them. I think as well, these pots make very good holders for signs. If you want to add a little bit more detail to your signs rather than just putting a sign on the ground, you can put it inside the pot and it's like a little thing to hold your sign. It makes it into more of a full build. Maybe it's kind of like a marker in the wilderness, like a signpost or something. And of course, in the new snapshots, they've added the ability to write on both sides of the sign. You could have a fence and then a sign to create a more tall signpost. In a similar way, you could have the pot, then a lightning rod, then a sign. You can take your pick out of these two. Quite a nice little banner, and obviously if you had like a design on there, you could have that to mark your little area. There's so many different ideas that you can do with these, and these are just a couple of little ones that I literally came up on the fly while I was recording this, which just proves how many different things there is you can do, because I just came up with these random little builds while recording. You could put a trim around it in the floor, as I was talking about there. It integrates it into the floor a lot better than just having it on the ground like that. And you can have a variety of blocks, whatever would fit into your build the best. So of course, because you've only got the one pixel here, we're choosing things where the outside pixel is more or less the same colour. We've got the barrel, which is quite cool, because not only does it have that edge around it, you can actually access it from underneath. So that's a tip for maybe having some secret storage that people might not notice. Have it underneath the pot. Especially if you make your base out of blocks that look similar, people wouldn't notice that. They would be none the wiser that you actually have a secret stash of items in here. We have an iron block, a gold block, and then we have an interesting one here, glass, which has that rim around it, and then tinted glass, which similarly has that black rim round. But again, there are so many options for things like this. Here's some other interesting little details that you can do with this. The Minecraft pressure plate is actually the exact same size, so because of that, they sit perfectly on top there, and you can add a little trim round the edge. So here we have the gold pressure plate, which I think matches very well with the slightly yellowy gold trim when you add the shards to a pot. Here we have the mangrove pressure plate, which matches the colour quite well. It adds a nice little cap. Same with the acacia pressure plate. It adds that nice little rim around the top. And then we have the iron pressure plate for a more modern type look. Here's something else I found after the main recording. It turns out the top of the clay pot can actually pass through the trapdoors. So if you place a trapdoor on top of the clay pot, you get this really interesting shape. And I think this could be used for some really interesting floorings for your builds, or maybe like a rug or something. I think it fits best in the cherry trapdoor, the mangrove trapdoor, and the bamboo trapdoor. And here's an example of what a full carpet / rug could look like in this style. Last but not least for this little section down here, we have some item frames. Yes, you can place the item frame directly on top of the block. The item frame on its own, again, adds a little bit of a trim around there. The freedom really comes in the items that you can put in the item frames. So here we have a yellow stained glass pane, and you're really looking for the items that fill up the entire inventory slot, because the only pixels on the item that will show are the ones on the very, very edge of the slot. For some reason I forgot to mention this in the original recording, but you can also rotate the stained glass and it looks pretty good in that orientation too. It creates this nice little ornate star pattern on the top of the pot. Now, one thing I did try, and sadly that you can't do, is you can't do that. One, there is a bit of Z fighting there, but eventually, after enough time, the item frame will pop off. Or not? Wait, what? Did they change this in an update? Huh. Okay, in whatever update that I was testing this in, if you put a torch or a pressure plate inside the item frame on top of the pot here, the item frame would pop off eventually. So basically any of these lights, any of these pressure plates can be combined with anything in these item frames. Just experiment all you can with this, because I assume some items will let you put them on and others won't. Nope, the flower pot doesn't like it, but the torch was okay. Next for the item frames here we have lichen, which I'm not sure if I'm the hugest fan of this, but I just included it because it does technically reach the side of the item slot. Not that noticeable, but it does add a little bit of extra detail there. Next up here we have the rails and the ladder, which just about go to the edge of the item slot, and I included both of these in the same thing here because they actually have the exact same footprint in the item slot, but they do add a little bit of detail, the slightest amount, because they do go to the edge of the block. I was just trying to find different items that go to the edge of the item slot, and honestly there isn't that many in the game that do that. And then here we have the end crystal, which does poke out the edge of the item frame, but only if you rotate it. It adds quite a nice little like neat star pattern in there. The only downside to this is the end crystal isn't actually centered in the block, which results in it being a bit uneven. I do quite like this idea with the item frames. This is my personal favorite though. Okay, we're going to be moving on to a few more full builds now that incorporate the decorated pot. This is kind of showcasing how you might use it in an actual like build environment. So I built like a fireplace type thing here, or a rack for drying out the pots. This is something that you might see if you have like a smeltery area and you want to add that little bit of more narrative to your base. Next up here, this is a very interesting way you can use this as a building block on the outside of the build. It makes a very, very good chimney. So these are the blocks that we have underneath the pot here. We have a campfire and then a hay bale. The hay bale's here so the campfire smoke rises faster, because if you didn't know, if you put a campfire on top of a hay bale, it actually makes the smoke rise a lot further in the air. And then you have the really nice smoke effect going out of there. So yeah, this is quite nice and a quite an interesting way of using the pot, not for its intended purpose. And finally here, we have different ways that you might use the pot to decorate an interior of a build. Oh hey look, 2 leads and some leather. So I've kind of built a mock-up interior here. This is kind of like a masonry, where you might have your area where you're storing all your different shards in maybe some barrels that I haven't placed down. The initial clay here that you're making the bricks out of, then you have them being smelted into the pot, and then you're applying some of the shards to them. Little station here maybe where you're perfecting the shards and making new ones, and a little storage chest. Yeah, I do like this interior. This is an example of something that I might make as like a functional room in a base. I've showcased quite a lot of things you can do with this and just talked about the sheer quantity of different combinations and just extra details that you could add with this. In the next video, we'll be doing a similar thing with a singular block. We'll be looking at the chiseled bookshelf and different ways you can use that. So subscribe and stick around for the chiseled bookshelf video to come out in the future. I do have a Patreon page if you want to support me. That would be very, very helpful. It would make it so I can make these videos more sustainably. The link to the Patreon is in the description as always. But with that said, I will see you in next week's video, which will likely be a Let's Play type video. And I really, really hope you enjoyed that because I'm excited to show you what I've been working on in my Let's Play world.